A World Without Borders, our final lecture for World History 2 online. Lecture terms. We have arrived in an era where we live in a globalized world. It is globalized economically and in some cases politically and socially. However, we do note that there are some new challenges to our new globalized world. Economic globalization is where we'll begin. As World War II came to an end, and as the Cold War came to an end, there was more participation in the reduction and removal of barriers between national borders economically. In particular, this was done to facilitate the flow of goods, capital, services, and labor for everyone's economy to ultimately be enhanced as a result. And this led to the creation of GATT, which was created right after World War II, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This would have 23 member nations, and this went hand in hand with the United States Marshall Plan to try to make sure that the economies of our Western allies in Europe remained strong so they would not fall prey to communism. This was part of the containment policy, if you recall. This will eventually give rise, after communism falls in Europe, we will see this will give rise to a new organization. The World Trade Organization takes over from GATT in 1995. Global corporations expand, and they treat the globe as a single market as a result. Now, the whole idea behind this is to promote the economies worldwide so everyone can have a stronger, more stable economy. However, oftentimes, as necessary, decentralization in some of these areas needs to take place to take maximum advantage of regional markets, labor pools, and taxation policies. Sometimes these global efforts don't work as smoothly as others because of differences of opinion on labor tactics, on labor rules, and as well as other kinds of economic policies. As I mentioned before, after World War II, we will see a real economic growth in Asia. It begins in Japan, largely because Japan was part of the Marshall Plan. We wanted, even though Japan had been our opponent in World War II, when the United States maintained a military presence in Japan after the war, occupying it, we wanted to make sure we built up Japan's economy to be a Western-style economy so it would not fall prey to a communist takeover. In particular, we were concerned because of the location of Japan so close to both China and Russia. So Japan benefited from the Marshall Plan. The treaty that was signed limited the amount of the money being poured into Japan that could be spent on defense, but ultimately Japan becomes a massive post-war economic giant. The industrial output of Japan becomes huge, and that is why until really, the last 2 or 3 decades, many of the items that we saw all over the world said made in Japan on them. Now, of course, they say made in China. China has eclipsed Japan as an industrial giant since the 1990s. Other areas of Asia will also experience massive economic growth. The 4 little tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, all grow from the mid-20th century forward by westernizing. And they are primarily export-driven. They want to create Western style products that are in great demand all over the world. And this ultimately creates stronger economies. There were some problems that came about in the late 90s, however, because these four little tigers had interrelated economies. And when one of the economies starts to falter because of lack of demand for the products that they were creating by that point, or glut in the market, if you will, it caused some problems that sort of had the ripple effect throughout the region. But most of these areas have recovered since the late 90s and have remained fairly strong economies. China, as we know, integrated elements of the market economy while maintaining communist rule. Odd bedfellows, yes they are. But ultimately, China was able to do this and become the industrial powerhouse that it is today. Of course, China also benefits from the huge, cheap labor pool that they have. So many people live in China, and without policies on maintaining certain conditions and human rights issues, China, the communist rule in China is able to take advantage of the situation and ultimately becomes the industrial world leader by really the early 2000s. Europe has attempted to create a more globalized economy throughout the region by creating trading blocs like the European Union. European Union was formed actually in 1957, but it only had 6 nations that belonged to it at that point. After the Maastricht Treaty of 1993, more and more nations will join the European Union, the EU, moving toward political integration. And as we know, a big part of the European Union was the creation of the Eurodollar and the Euro passport. This will allow for easier travel between the nations as well as easier trade, all using one similar currency. Another one of the trading blocs that will become a major mover and shaker in the economic world, in this economic globalized world, is of course the creation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This was established in 1960 and has been dominated by the Arab and Muslim world ever since. The OPEC was able to use their economic might to place an embargo on U.S. oil between 1973 and 1975, when we were getting involved in the region with problems going on in Iran and then Iraq. This will cause a problem in the American marketplace in the 70s that will lead to massive inflation. But there were other areas where we see these trading blocs helped to promote the economies of the regions. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, was a similar trading bloc to the EU, just in Asia. These trading blocs ultimately promote the economies of these regions, and they will help in creating a globalized economy. Now, economic globalization is one thing, but what about diplomatic globalization? What about political globalization? International diplomacy has really gone through the ringer in the recent decades. The United Nations, if you recall, was the international organization created after World War II that superseded the failed League of Nations. The Charter of the United Nations was to maintain international peace and security. And up through the 1950s, it was seemingly able to do that through the threat of the use of sanctions, economic as well as military sanctions, if nations started acting in a defiant way. However, since the 1950s, the United Nations has become a weaker body in military areas. They are more influential in larger public health projects, for example, the eradication of smallpox, and of course, the UN supporters of universal human rights. The problem is, ever since the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and especially as we moved into the 90s, global terrorism threatens international diplomacy and global unity. Terrorism is something that is deliberate and systematic. It is the use of violence against civilians largely also. This kind of deliberate, systematic use of violence is cheaper and more effective than conventional warfare, and thus it's accessible to smaller groups. Unfortunately, the United Nations is an international organization that can use its power of sanctions against other nations that act in a rogue way. But the UN is not able to use sanctions against terrorist groups that utilize these new kinds of tactics, like Al-Qaeda, for example. So the UN has been inoculated in this new kind of international struggle, this new kind of international revolution. The story, of course, continues as we finish this course. Are revolutions based on terrorism going to continue to plague our world? And are we going to effectively ever again be able to deal with these kinds of struggles through international diplomacy? Or is the world headed for some other kind of catastrophic revolution in the future? This all remains to be seen, but I do remain hopeful that over time our global community will be able to come together and work out through diplomacy a better way, a better world. I appreciate your attention this course. I hope that you've had a good semester, and best of luck on your final exams. Thank you.